All right, so this is our first lecture for the basic chemistry unit. We're actually going to start off, though, with some cell biology basics. So cell biology basics. So we're going to kind of start by talking about biology in general. We're talking about the organization of life, different characteristics of living things, and then we'll get into the actual chemistry of life here. So first, a couple of definitions. This course is biology, or is based on biology. And so what is biology? Biology is the scientific study of living things. So we're going to be looking at the study of living things. And in this course specifically, we're going to be talking about things, everything from basic chemistry or inorganic chemistry to organic chemistry to genetics. And then at the end of the semester, we're going to be taking a look at the different body systems. And throughout the semester, it's going to be geared toward anatomy and physiology or human anatomy and physiology, because this is kind of a prerequisite or kind of a course that's looked to be an intro course into anatomy and physiology. But of course, this is just a general biology course called Cell Biology Basics. So biology is the scientific study of living things. And then specifically, when we're talking about cell biology, what we're looking at is the study of the structure and function of cells. And we're going to be taking a very, very close look at cells. In one of our units, it's all about the cell, the different parts of the cell, how those cell parts function together. So in biology, we're looking at our study of living things, and then we're looking specifically at cell biology. So we're going to get down into kind of the small pieces of biology. So when we talk about a living thing, let's move into what is a living thing. So we're going to be talking about the different characteristics. So different characteristics of living things. So the first characteristic of a living thing that we're going to talk about is that all living things are cellular. That is, that they are made up of cells. And so when we talk about any living thing, we're talking about things like bacteria, we're talking about people or humans, we're talking about trees, we can talk about algae, we can talk about other animals, dogs, cats, whales. They're all made up of one or more cells. So one or more cells. If we're talking about something like a bacteria, for example, or maybe a protozoa, we can be talking about one cell. If we're talking about multiple cells or more cells, then we'd be talking about something more complex like trees or animals, humans, things like that. And then when we talk about a cell, again, we're going to be looking at an entire unit that we'll be looking at in regards to the cell. But there are some basic cell components that you should be aware of right off the bat here. So our basic cell components are these. So the first one is that there's a membrane. Oftentimes this is a plasma membrane. And this is what's going to separate the cell from the surroundings. And when we take a look at the plasma membrane in closer detail, we'll see that some things are allowed to get into the cell, some things are allowed to leave the cell, some things are not allowed to get in or not allowed to leave. And so this plasma membrane is what's going to be the barrier between that living thing, that cell, and the exterior. And again, when we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about the whole organism being in that one cell and its interaction with the exterior. In a multicellular organism, we would be talking about that cell, how it interacts with other cells, but then also how it interacts with the exterior. So the first part of our basic cell, or the first component, would be that it has a membrane. So all of our cells have membranes. The second one is that it has nuclear information, so DNA or RNA. Oftentimes we're talking about DNA, though, and that's what we'll be focusing on in this class specifically as the main form of instructions. This is how we store instructions for how to build and maintain the cell. And so if we're talking about a bacteria, for example, or algae or a human, all of these things have DNA as part of their cell components. So this is going to store the information for how to build and maintain the cell. So that's our second component. We'll be taking a closer look at DNA, the structure of DNA, how it works to store this information, how we get the information out of it. But then the third component that we'll talk about, or the basic cell components, is the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is kind of this gooey gel material that's in the cell. It is within the cell membrane, of course, because the cell membrane is the barrier. It's what keeps it separate, kind of the outside of a balloon. Let's pretend a water balloon, for example. The actual rubber part of the water balloon would be the cell membrane. And then in the inside, the water would be the cytoplasm. And then within that cytoplasm, we would have the DNA. And we'll talk about that in different ways in the future. But the cytoplasm would be kind of this watery interior. And in this cytoplasm, this is where we have all of the chemicals that are needed for the functions of life. So we would have all of the different pieces that we need that we're putting together to make certain things, to secrete out of the cell or to maintain in the cell, all the different components that are going to be used to make energy or break down things. So the cytoplasm is kind of this gooey gel matrix that contains all chemicals needed for the functions of life. And again, we're going to take a closer look at that as we move forward in the semester. So our characteristics of living things here, our first characteristic that we're talking about is that if it is a living thing, then it is made up of cells. It is cellular. So we're going to kind of move on, and we'll move up to our second characteristic of living things. So characteristic number 2 is that all living things must maintain homeostasis. And so when we're talking about homeostasis, what we're really meaning is that it's maintaining an internal environment. So maintaining internal environment. And so this could mean things like maintaining body temperature. So when we go outside as humans, when we go outside and it's a very, very cold day, our body is going to adjust. It's going to maintain homeostasis, meaning this internal environment. So it's going to do what it needs to do in order to adjust to being in this cold temperature. So we might start shivering, for example, to increase our body temperature, to maintain the temperature within our body, even though we're in a cold exterior environment. The opposite is also true. If we go outside and it's a very, very hot day, then our body is going to do what it can to bring down the core temperature, bring down the body temperature, and maintain this internal environment. And so we have these different what are called set points for maintaining homeostasis. So we have our set point of body temperature, which is at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But we have other things that we can talk about too. Things like blood glucose level. So glucose is very, very important. That's our main energy form. So we need to maintain the appropriate glucose level in our body so we maintain the appropriate level of energy. Things like heart rate. So we want to make sure that our heart isn't pumping too fast, it's not pumping too slow. Things like water balance. So we don't want to be too dehydrated. We don't want to have too much fluid and have edema where we're having issues with movement. And some other things, some different things like salt balance or other ions, balance of different ions in the body that we want to make sure that we have at an appropriate level. So our bodies are going to be maintaining homeostasis. And again, homeostasis is this state of balance. And that's going to be in all of the different cells. Again, we're talking about life in general, although I use humans as an example most times. When we're talking about life in general, we're talking about the bacteria as well, or algae or fungus. All of these different things also maintain homeostasis. Our third characteristic of life is that all living things have a metabolism. So metabolism, its most basic sense, is just the use of energy. So metabolism is our use of energy. So when we talk about metabolism, what we're really talking about, when we're talking about this using of energy, we're talking about taking in molecules that contain energy and then converting them into energy that can be used by the cells to build different molecules or maintain homeostasis or to reproduce or to grow. So we are taking in energy and then we convert it to usable energy by our cells. And then we use that energy to do various things in the body. So to build molecules, maintain homeostasis, and various other things that we'll talk about. So when we're talking about this metabolism, we can think about it in the most basic sense of the term to begin with, is that all energy begins with light energy. So it's all going to start from the sun, our light energy from the sun. And so then what we're doing in this taking in energy is we can take in light energy from the sun, and then that's going to be converted into chemical energy. Now you can probably guess that we humans don't do this. We don't have the ability to take in light energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy. So think about for a moment, what does this? So what's going to take light energy from the sun and convert it into a chemical energy? Right, so this is going to be things like plants, right? So plants and some bacteria. Right, so we have our plants and some bacteria that are going to take light energy from the sun, and then they're going to convert that into chemical energy. When they convert that into chemical energy, generally that's in the form of their cell walls and other things like starch. So they're going to take the light energy, they're going to turn it into chemical energy. Then there are those that are going to take that chemical energy and then they're going to use that chemical energy. So use the chemical energy by breaking it down. And then you can imagine, what does this? So what eats plants? We do. So we can talk about animals in this sense. So animals are going to be taking that chemical energy from plants, eating the plants, and then they're going to use that, break down that chemical energy that's been stored in the bonds in plants, and then break it down into energy that can be used by animals. So for our example, if we eat a potato, for example, we can utilize the starches that plant has made. So they take the energy from the sun, the light from the sun, convert it into these long chains called starch. Then when we eat the potato, we can take those long chains that we call starch and break them into individual pieces. When we break them into individual pieces, we then break them down further and turn them into our energy form, which is called ATP. We'll get into that in more detail. So then we take that ATP and we can use that ATP in order to fuel different things in the system. And so then when we talk about energy, energy can be transferred many, many times. We can see that it's started out from the light from the sun, converted into chemical energy in the form of, say, starch, for example. Then we can take that starch and we can convert it into ATP. Then inside of an animal body, we can use that ATP in order to build things like proteins or build things like other carbohydrates that we need, build DNA, build RNA. And so we are taking this energy and we're able to convert it or transfer it many times. But each time it's transferred, we lose some energy as heat. So it's not a one-to-one per se. When we bring the energy in, we can convert some, but we do lose some as heat. We also have bacteria and fungi that are going to be breaking down the dead plants and dead animals, and then they can release the nutrients, they can recycle the nutrients, but the energy that was in those things is now lost. All right, so moving on to our next characteristic of life. So characteristic number 4 is going to be growth and development. So when we talk about our characteristics of life, if something is living, then it has to change over the lifespan. Oops. All right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So changing over the lifespan. So one, growing, meaning growing in size. So as humans, we start from a single cell combining with or kind of a half cell combining with another half cell, which are actually called individual cells, but those two cells coming together, and then those cells are going to divide and divide and divide and divide. They're going to grow in size, so we can say cells grow in size and in number. So our cells can grow larger and larger and larger, but they can also grow in the number of cells. So if you think about an egg, for example, from a chicken or other bird, that's one large cell, so it's a very, very large cell. It will grow from very small to very large. In multicellular organisms like ourselves, then we have individual cells, and they multiply to create more cells. So there's growth involved. Different types of cells are made. And then there's also a maturing. So growth as in there's the ability to mature. And then in that ability to mature, that's part of the development. So we're developing into a mature organism. And then that mature organism is then going to be able to reproduce. And we see the same thing in bacteria, for example. So the bacteria itself is going to, when it's in an environment that has lots of nutrients, for example, it's going to take in those nutrients, it's going to grow larger, so it'll grow in size because it'll be making copies of everything in the cell. And then as it's doing that, that's kind of a maturation process where it's going to be producing all of these things. It will duplicate its DNA, duplicate everything inside of its cell, and then it will reproduce. And in that case, what that means is binary fission, which is where it's going to just split the cell in half and have a duplication of the cell. In multicellular organisms, that's a different process that we'll talk about, but we have growth and development in anything that's living. Our fifth characteristic is reproduction. So after our growth and then development, so we're growing and then we develop, we mature, and then that allows us to be able to reproduce. So anything that is alive has to be able to produce more of their own kind. And so anything, meaning that things can asexually reproduce, or there can be sexual reproduction. So if we're talking about bacteria, for example, let's say bacteria, or maybe a fungus, we might be talking about asexually reproducing. So this is where one parent produces copies of itself. So in this case, what we're talking about is, so for example, in a bacteria and fungus, making a whole new organism. So in this case, it would be something like cell division. We're talking about binary fission. But then in a multicellular organism, this could be just regeneration or cell division. So within our own body, our skin cells, for example, are going to be going through reproduction. We're going to be producing more and more of our own individual skin cells, for example. When we're talking about the whole organism, however, especially in a multicellular organism or a human animal, we would be talking about sexual reproduction. So this is where we see our genetic information from two parents mixed to produce offspring. Now these are going to be different than either parent. So when we talk about our asexual reproduction, we're talking about it being the same. So it's going to be exactly the same. So for example, in our bacteria, when it goes through asexual reproduction, it's making an exact copy of itself. When we're talking about sexual reproduction, we're talking about different, meaning that the offspring is going to be different from either parent. There's no identical offspring that comes from those two parents. And this is one of the concepts that we'll talk about. And this is how we get genetic diversity, is we have two different individuals with different DNA coming together to make a whole new individual. So our sixth characteristic of life is evolving. So evolution. And so when we're talking about something being living, we say that it has to have the ability to evolve. And what this means is that the species is changing over time. Now, this could be due to something like random mutations in the DNA. So we can have some random mutation or a change in the DNA that's going to cause some change in an organism. So, for example, some people are unable to be infected by HIV, the HIV virus, and that's because they've had a random DNA mutation that makes it so the cell receptor that HIV uses is unable to be used as an attachment site for HIV. So if HIV gets into the body of a person that has had this random mutation, then HIV is unable to attach to the cell and unable to infect the cell. So this would be an example of a random mutation in DNA. And so then if this person were to then have a child with another person and that random mutation is passed on, then their offspring will now have the inability to get HIV in order to get that infection. And so then if this is something that is randomly mutated within a population, and then this is being passed on and passed on over time, we will have a change in this species. So we will have a change to where some proportion or some portion of the population is going to be unable to get HIV or unable to be infected by the HIV virus. And then that provides evolution. That's an evolutionary change. So if the change provides an advantage, then those individuals will have more offspring. So for example, in the HIV one, that's an advantage. The person will not be able to get HIV and therefore will not perhaps get sick and then end up not having children or die early and not have children. In this case, that would be advantageous, meaning that the person doesn't get HIV and then perhaps they'll pass that on to their offspring. Now, there can also be random mutations in DNA that are not advantageous. So if it is something that is damaging, meaning that causes something that is an illness to the body where the person may die at an earlier time than perhaps the most of the population, or have a difficult time having offspring for whatever case or whatever situation, then we would not see that change. We would not see that random mutation continue through the population. And so then what we see is if it is advantageous, then we can see that it changes over time in that population. So an example that's not human related, so we talked about the HIV virus, but then if it's not human related, we could talk about something like antibiotic resistance. So for bacteria, for example, if we're not talking about humans, we can see that there's a mutation in the bacteria that allows them to be resistant to an antibiotic. And if they're resistant to the antibiotic, then they don't die, and then they're able to produce copies of themselves, and then the copies of themselves will now contain this mutation that allows them to not die because of that particular antibiotic being in the environment. And so then they're allowed to live, but those that do not have this mutation then will die, and then over time the population will have this mutation, and then we have antibiotic resistance. We also see this in lactose tolerance. So lactose is something that over time adults tend to not be able to handle lactose. It's something that is, we have lots and lots of enzymes to break down lactose when we're very small because of nursing from the mother and breaking down the lactose that we're getting. And then as we're growing, that milk is no longer required. We can get our nutrients from other sources. And so over time, those enzymes tend to decrease in quantity and ability. And so then as an adult, people tend to have issues with lactose. Now over time, though, this can change, or this has changed to where lots of people now are lactose tolerant even as adults. So this allows us to have this additional food source. All right, so moving on to our last characteristic. So 6 was evolution. Now we're moving on to our last characteristic, which is number 7, our characteristic of human life, which is organization or organized. So meaning that if we're talking about something that is a living thing, it is highly complex and organized. And we're going to talk about this in more detail in just a moment here. But what we're talking about is that even when we're talking about a bacteria, there's a lot of things going on in the bacteria. They have DNA, they have RNA, they have all the different organelles, they can have cell walls, they can have other various things, flagella, for example, all the way up to humans, which are very, very complex. And so if it's a living thing, it's going to be complex, it'll have various systems, and it's organized. So we can see the stepwise manner, we can see the organization of this organism or of this living thing. So those are our 7 characteristics of living things. So if we kind of back up for just a moment, we talked about general biology, and then we went through the characteristics of living things. So 1 through 7, cellular, maintaining homeostasis, metabolism, growth and development, reproduction, evolution, and that they're organized. And so now what I'd like to do for the rest of this lecture is talk a bit about the organization of life. And we're going to go through some of the general organization of life as a whole. And then we can apply this to humans specifically. So I will scoot over here for a moment, and we're going to talk now about the organization of life. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the organization of life from the smallest unit to the largest unit. So the very first one is the atom. And we're going to be addressing these throughout the entire semester. So this is why we start in chemistry, because atom is our smallest unit of matter. And so when we're talking about the atom, what we're talking about are elements. And we're going to talk about these in more detail, of course, but some examples. Carbon, which when we're talking about life, carbon is the number 1 element for life. It's the most important one. It's the one that we have in most molecules, most things that are built within something that is living. So carbon, some other examples of the most important elements would be hydrogen. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then various other ones. So these are our 4 main atoms, or 4 main elements that are important to life is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then we have some other ones that are important as well. So things like phosphorus, things like sodium, things like calcium, things like iron. So there are lots of other elements, of course. All of the elements are important to life. These are just the main ones. So our organization of life starts out as the smallest unit of matter, which is the atom. Then we move up to 2, which is molecules. So if we're talking about atom is the smallest unit of matter, then if we take atoms and we put atoms together, we get a molecule. So molecules are formed by bonds between atoms. And so when we talk about an atom, we have the nucleus here, and we're going to get into more detail of this, of course. We have the nucleus, and then we have our different electrons that are flying around this nucleus. So we're talking about the smallest unit of life there is the atom. And then when we have our molecules, we can say that we take our different atoms and we're going to combine them. And so then they're going to have some sort of bond between them. And we will talk about the different types of bonds. So we have 2 different nuclei here. And then we have the electrons that are kind of floating around and floating around the different nuclei. So molecules can be small. So we can have things like 2 atoms together. So for example, we can have very, very small atoms. And then we can also have very, very large atoms. Coming together, or very, very small molecules, which would be 2 atoms, Or we can have very, very large molecules, which would be billions of atoms. So some examples of our molecules or atoms coming together would be carbon dioxide. So CO2, C would be the carbon and O would be the oxygen. So in this case, it's 1 carbon and 2 oxygen, so CO2. Water, H2O, so 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen for water. So things like sugar. And when we say sugar, we can start out with the most simple form, which would be glucose. Okay, glucose has many different atoms stuck together or bonded together. Things like proteins. Proteins are made up of many atoms coming together. Things like fats or lipids. And then also our DNA, our nucleic acids. So when we take atoms and we bond them together, attach them to each other, then we get molecules. So we're going from smallest and we're getting a little bit bigger. If we get even bigger than molecules, when we take molecules together, then what we get are organelles. So organelles are parts of a cell formed by molecules. So then we have these molecules that are coming together and making up an organelle. So for example, we've already talked about a cell just a little bit, and what we have already mentioned are things like the plasma membrane. So our membrane of the cell, the outer region, the thing that separates the cell from the exterior, is a type of organelle, or is an organelle, and that's formed by many, many different molecules, and we'll take a look at those individual molecules, but we're getting larger and larger. So we've taken atoms, put them together to make molecules, take molecules, put those together to make organelles. So we have membrane, our nucleus is an organelle, our mitochondria. You might have heard the mitochondria before, the powerhouse of the cell. That's another type of organelle. Now, if we take our organelles and we put various organelles together, what we're going to get then is the cell. And so remember, the cell is this is our smallest living unit. So up here, the atom is our smallest unit of matter, so something that takes up space, matter. The cell is our smallest living unit, so something that's alive. So we have to have all these different organelles to make up the cell. So our cell are organelles functioning together to create a living cell. So we've already talked about some examples of cells, but some examples would be a bacteria cell. We talked about, let's say, trees, so a leaf cell. We can talk about a muscle cell in an animal. We can talk about an algal cell. So again, the cell is our basic unit of life, and so it has to have all the characteristics listed above: atoms, molecules, organelles. So then if we take our cell, we take several cells and put those together, then we get our next level of organization, which is called a tissue. So our tissue is where we have different cells. Working together to make a tissue. All right, and actually in this case I'm going to cross out different, and I'm going to say many cells working together to make a tissue, because in this case what we're doing is we're taking the same types of cells. In some cases it'll be the exact same type of cell. In other cases it'll be different types of cells coming together to make up a tissue. And so we have our tissue, which is our cells working together. And so we have our cells, so for example, the epidermis of a leaf. That's a specific part of the leaf that are all going to be working together to make a tissue. We can also have the epidermis of the skin. So for animals, We have the most superficial layer, the outermost layer is called the epidermis. So we have different types of cells that are all working together to make up the epidermis of the skin. And then we can even think about things like muscle tissue, for example. When we think of our muscles are a type of tissue. Now, if we take our tissue, we get to, let's see, number 6. If we take different types of tissues and put them together now, then we get what's called an organ. So different tissues combine to form organs. And in this case, they are going to perform a specific function. So, for example, if we bring a bunch of cells together, so we said the epidermis of the cell, for example, but if we bring up the different parts of the leaf, the epidermis of the leaf, if we bring in all the other parts of the leaf, then we get the leaf itself, which would be considered an organ of the tree. If we take our muscle tissue and then we put our muscle tissue together, then we can get our heart, for example, which is an organ. We have different types of muscle tissue. We bring those tissues together. Our muscle tissue, we bring some fat tissue, put those different things together, we get the heart. Also, another organ, the brain. We bring different types of tissue together, provide a specific function, the brain, to send out messages, bring in messages, process messages. So we have our different types of organs, is where we have our different tissues working together to perform a specific function as an organ. Now, if we take different organs and put those together, then we get what's called the organ system. So our organ system would be then several organs working together. So, for example, the above ground part of a plant. Another organ system would be something like the muscular system in a human, for example, or another animal. The nervous system, so we said the brain was an organ here. If we take the brain and the spinal cord and the different nerves, then we have the nervous system. And so if we take different parts or different organs and put them together, we have the different systems. So we have the cardiovascular system, we have the urinary system, we have the skeletal system. So these are our organ systems. Now, if we take different organ systems, like we were just mentioning, the muscular system, the nervous system, the skeletal system, we take all of the organ systems and put those together, then we get what's called the organism. So the organism is where we have our organ systems combine to carry out the functions of life. So if we have our organism, we're going to be carrying out the functions of life. So for example, the whole tree. So rather than our organ system, which would be the above ground parts, now we're including the root system, for example. So that would be the whole tree, or the whole human, for example. We take all of our different systems, put them together, we get the human. Now, if we take different organisms and we put a bunch of different organisms together, then we get number 9, which is a population. So population have all organisms of the same species in an area. So all the organisms of the same species in an area. So, for example, all of the oak trees in Michigan. Or all of the people in St. Clair County. So our population are going to be organisms of the same species is the key here. So same species in a particular area. So that you would need both of those parts. So we're talking about people, St. Clair County. We're talking about oak trees specifically in Michigan. So you need to have the organism and the area that it's located in order to be clear that that is a population. Now, if we have different organisms, right, we have groups of organisms in a specific area, put those together. Now what we're talking about is a community. So this would be all the populations in an area. So this would be, for example, if we were talking about all of the humans, all of the fish, all of the frogs, dogs, worms, insects, cats, trees, everything, bacteria in St. Clair County. So every, let's say, living thing in St. Clair County. Now this would be all the different populations, like we said, the humans, the fish, the birds, the trees, the grasses, all of the different organisms all together in St. Clair County. Now if we took then all of the populations in an area are a community, right? Then if we take the community, which again are all of these living things in one area, and its physical environment, then we have what's called an ecosystem. So our ecosystem is a community and its physical environment. So what we're talking about in this example would be our community. So again, humans, trees, birds, fish, dogs, cats, all of the different community or all of the different populations in a particular area, say St. Clair County. So the community plus the water, right? The different water we have around here, the rocks, the sand, the air, all of this stuff in St. Clair County. Then, if we move from the ecosystem and we take several ecosystems, namely all of the ecosystems, right? So this is all of the areas, all of the communities and the physical environments in the entire Earth. Now we're at the biosphere. So the biosphere are all ecosystems making up the Earth. So this includes all of the parts of the Earth that sustain life. Because we're talking about an ecosystem, and if we're talking about an ecosystem, then we're talking about a community. If we're talking about a community, it's a population. If we're talking about a population, it includes an organism. An organism is a living thing. So it has to be a living thing, and then the living thing's physical environment. Right? So all of the living things on the Earth and all of the physical environments that the living things live in. So this is our biosphere. So we have gone from our smallest piece, right, the organization of life. We start out with the atom, which is our smallest unit of matter. Then we take our atoms, put them together to make molecules, our molecules, put them together to make organelles, take our organelles, put those together to make a cell. That provides us with our smallest living unit. So we can't have an organelle just living on its own. It has to have other organelles within a membrane to make it a cell. And then that's when we have our first living unit. Then we have different cells, many different cells working together to make a tissue. Then we have different tissues working together to make an organ. Then we have organs working together to make an organ system. Then we have organ systems working together to make an organism. Then we have several organisms in a population. So again, the same species in a particular area makes up a population. And then we have all of the populations in a particular area make up the community. Then if we have the community along with its physical environment, that makes up an ecosystem, and then we have all of the ecosystems that make up the Earth, which is called a biosphere. So this concludes kind of the introduction to the course, our cell biology course. We've gone over the characteristics of living things, and we've gone over the organization of life. I talked a bit about what biology is, about cell biology specifically, as this course is Cell Biology Basics. And then now what we're going to do for the rest of this part of the unit is talk more specifically about these different things up here. The atom and molecule level is going to be the rest of our basic chemistry unit.